Tonight we are talking boundaries with three lovely ladies who I'm joined by. I'm sure you already know Mel. I don't think you've probably met Jacky before, anybody that's watching. Hi. And Karolina, who has agreed, they've all agreed to talk to us about boundaries, which we're very, very grateful for. Ladies, how were your boundaries a decade or two ago? Maybe that's a good place to start. Okay, let me start. Mine were pretty non-existent. I don't even think I knew what boundaries were or had ever heard of them personally. Anybody
No,
else?
I was far too busy trying to be nice to have a boundary.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody is being wild.
Being wild rather than nice.
Oh, brilliant.
So,
Yeah,
Karolina?
I agree. I hadn't really heard of boundaries. I didn't know what they were. I wasn't really sure what my boundaries were, how to communicate them. And yeah, it's been a bit of a journey, really. But now I'm really passionate about them. And yeah, it's a topic I really like discussing.
Because what did we do without them? That's what I'm trying to get my head around. Like, in a world where you didn't know what boundaries were, I don't know. I mean, I just wonder what used to happen to everybody with no boundaries. What were some of the repercussions?
Well, I describe it as I either ended up in cul-de-sacs or hit by juggernauts. That was
Not a very vivid description.
yeah, absolutely. I can relate to that. Oh, goodness.
That was what happened without boundaries. It was, yeah, being run over or being absolutely stuck and not knowing what to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, it was the feeling of either constantly being taken advantage of or constantly resenting people for not getting back in return what I was giving.
Yeah.
I think for me it was that this feeling of not really having a strategy of, you know, not really knowing if what was going to happen and if anyone was going to say something or do something, and kind of just having to hope that they wouldn't, you know. And I'm thinking back to, for example, bullying at school now, where you would just hope that, you know, the kids wouldn't say something nasty, or because then you're not really sure what to do.
No.
Yeah, I
and
think
also, sorry, you just don't seem to ever have a voice, do you, with no boundaries? You can never implement a voice, you can never speak up for yourself, you can never say anything, you know. And as Jacky, you said, it's that please appease constantly, isn't it?
Well, I think it's, you know, it's also, I forgot what I was going to say now, but I was going to say there's another layer of, of gaslighting yourself.
Yeah.
That's what I would do. It was, I would be doubting myself or saying, oh no, I must be misunderstood, or I got it wrong, or I shouldn't feel that way. That's really what it comes down. I shouldn't feel that way.
Yeah.
I'm too sensitive.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Be able to just shake it off.
Yeah.
So for anybody that's tuning in, I suppose a good place to start, after we've kind of said about the nightmare of not having had boundaries for all of us and how difficult it was, is what do we mean by boundaries, and what are they? What are boundaries?
We had an interesting chat, didn't we, before we started, because there are so many different ways to describe boundaries, aren't there?
Yeah.
You know, you can, I mean, Melanie, you were saying about this, weren't you? Do you want to share what you were saying about how you describe boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's boundaries are about knowing what it is that I need to protect myself from. And it's about deciding what I am and what I am not responsible for.
Yeah.
And it is about speaking my truth and holding the line. And I think that for me is kind of it in a bit of a nutshell, but it's also this journey of having been conditioned to need to ask the world for permission. You know, I need to know from other people that it is okay. I need to be validated. I need to be affirmed. I need to be liked. I need to please, and therefore I'm going to ask permission for everything. So for me, it was a journey from the need to ask permission to the belief that it's okay to tell somebody what it is that I need or don't need, or what is or isn't okay, rather than asking for permission because I feel that I need to be validated or affirmed.
Yeah, you can't take care of someone else's feelings when you're setting a boundary. And really what you're doing, I think it's an act of intimacy. I think a boundary is an act of intimacy, because what you're saying is, this is who I am and I want to share my values with you, what's valuable to me. And that means that I'm okay with some stuff and I'm not okay with others. And I think that's the crux of it. But I like what you said as well, Melanie, about speaking my truth and holding the line, because so often it can be about gaining that confidence to, I'm going to speak up and I'm going to say it. And now why isn't the world bowing down to me because I've said my boundary? Yeah. And then, of course, it gets dismissed and minimized and critiqued. And, you know.
I think people find that really difficult. And I think when we get to the bit about, you know, setting boundaries and how to hold boundaries later on, I think, you know, coming up with some ideas about how to do that, because you're right, both of you, it's really, really difficult. But boundaries for me are about protection and containment, you know, protecting the self and containing oneself and what comes in and goes out of that boundary. And I know, you know, at the Priory, we used to describe them as kind of either walls or nice picket fences, or things that you could see over, or things that you kind of hid behind. And I think a boundary is a limit or an edge or something that kind of says, here's where I start and finish, and here's where you begin and end. And I'm not going to kind of own your stuff or take over responsibility for that, but nor do you have to for mine either. So that's how I see it. Karolina, what about you? What are boundaries for you?
Well, I think it's some kind of feeling that you can kind of tune into when something happens. And it can just be a feeling of, I don't like it, I don't want it, or it doesn't feel comfortable. So for me, I think identifying boundaries, it's very much thinking about what's okay for me and what's not okay.
Okay. So yeah, it's that issue of, you know, what's mine? How does it make me feel? You know, what's the feeling within me? That's my own kind of recognition of a boundary might be being violated or not, I guess.
And I think
acknowledge a comment that's come in here from Annabelle, who says, my experience of speaking up my boundary is sadly very negative and painful. And I think, you know, Annabelle, I can certainly relate to that on a lot of levels. And that's something that I think we will definitely come to later. So hopefully you'll be able to stick around for a bit, Annabelle, and hear a bit more about our experience on that. But we hear you. We hear you on that.
Yeah. And also it's kind of the point, because if we didn't need to set the boundary, we wouldn't get that kind of response.
Yeah.
So, and also I wanted to come back to Karolina's point, because what you were saying about that innate sense, and if you think about when we're babies, and as babies we might turn our head when we don't want to eat anymore, or we don't want the attention of that person, and how that gets educated out of us of, like, you know, have another mouthful, you know, go and hug your auntie, or like, it happens from a really early age, doesn't it, of that people pleasing, don't speak up in order to try and fit into some other kind of social construct that's going on.
So we're already adapting our boundaries really from quite early on. So what do you think are the different types of boundaries? Because we've said what are boundaries, but what are the different types of boundaries?
I mean, I think if we break them down, you know, kind of easily into categories that would be easily understood. I think for me, there's physical, emotional, spiritual, sexual,
Yeah.
But I know that,
Yeah.
that Karolina, you mentioned something earlier that really resonated with me, that I hadn't kind of thought to articulate.
Time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love
And
that.
yeah, and I think that's so important where we might overstretch ourselves. And I think, in fact, when I think about it now, I'm thinking this could also come in, for example, in work situations where, because boundaries may not just be person to person, it could be actually in your organization where you take on too much work, or you overgive of your time.
Yeah.
And it means you have no time left for yourself to kind of have time for your own self-care and your own rests and recuperation.
And I kind of think that I put that in relational boundaries, which I kind of think slightly differently maybe to emotional boundaries, in that the most difficult thing for a codependent in recovery is actually to not people please and to be able to say no. So that comes up in time, it comes up in relationships, it comes up in all manner of ways, doesn't it? That people pleasing.
Yeah, it comes up in relationship with yourself, especially as well. It doesn't actually have to be relationship with others. It can be, in relationship with yourself as well.
Yeah. So there's internal boundaries then and external boundaries.
Absolutely. And I think really, I just wanted to go just back a little bit to Jacky, what you said about how, as children, we're already being conditioned out of those boundaries. So, we're saying no to food, and we're being told to eat more. We're being told to maybe hug relatives that we don't want to, all of that kind of stuff. And this is what I say, is that we are conditioned from such a young age to stop trusting what we know to be true. We are being disconnected from our authentic selves through trauma at such a young age that no wonder when we go into adulthood, setting boundaries becomes just impossible, because we don't know what we trust. And this is what I say to my clients, which is when they say to me, but how do I even know when to set a boundary? And again, coming back to what Karolina was saying, is when something's not sitting right. When someone does something or says something, or you read something and you get that feeling, trust that. That is something telling you that a boundary is being crossed and you need to put one in place.
Okay, so that's a brilliant point, and we've gone on to kind of question 3 that I had for you.
Sorry.
That's all right. I love the way that you did a great segue there. Why might we find setting boundaries difficult? Because you're so right, all of you. We adapt, we smile, we don't take our feelings to people, we don't show our real self as children, because that's all got to be hidden and behind. Most of my clients today, I've had a client day today, most of them are saying they couldn't be their real selves as kids and take their real emotions, and they had to put a happy face on it and smile. So we're losing all of that authentic stuff. So how do we begin even to start saying, this is what's happening for me, or this is my internal sense, or this doesn't feel quite right? How do we ever start to do that?
We start really imperfectly and really messily. That's how we start.
Yes, Jacky, we do.
And each time we set one, we learn from it. And we learn a bit more of how that made us feel and what the response was to the other person.
Yeah, and I think tied to that, and also what Melanie just said about how we get conditioned out of our boundaries. I think then when we want to set boundaries in adulthood, quite often that is with those people that conditioned us out of our boundaries. So I think that's why it can be so difficult, because of course then when we're going to start changing something and put a boundary in, there's going to be a great resistance in those particular people, such as our original family, because it was really convenient for them when we didn't have boundaries, and now we're going to try and communicate them. And that brings up so much in actually the whole family system, I think, because you all have each place, your own place in a way.
If I was to offer some really practical advice as well, I think it'd be two things. One, a boundary doesn't have to be followed up by an explanation. You don't have to explain why we're setting that boundary. And you know, you can write a script. I have written scripts before, gotten on the phone, said what I needed to say, and the repetition, almost like a mantra. It's like, well, this is the, you know, this is what I'm willing to share about this and what I want to say about it. And I'm just going to keep on repeating that and not get into the argument as to why I've set that up, or, you know, the impact it's having on other people.
It's interesting because when we used to do the family program, you know, when I was in rehab, we would sit 2 chairs opposite one another, and we would give people the script, and the family member who was listening to what the client said, and then we had to do it back the other way, is you're not allowed to speak. You cannot say anything. You can't rebuke. You can't comment. You're not even allowed to give a dirty look or raise your eyebrows. All of that is an absolute no-no. And you have to listen to the person saying, when you blah-de-blah-de-blah behavior, I feel or I felt X. So future, I would rather if this happened. And that's it. That's it. There's no negotiation of that. And we were really bloody tough about it, because it's awful just starting to speak out. When you, I felt, and people are terrified often. You've got their mothers or their brothers or their uncles, whoever it is in front of them that represents somebody that they can't put a boundary in. And what, you're asking me to do it? It's really hard, isn't it?
It's really hard. And that's why I say about it being messy and imperfect, because I don't think you can underestimate just how tricky it is. Because if it was easy, you'd have done it.
Yes.
Or if it was easy, you wouldn't have to do it.
Yes.
And I'd just like to say, for me, that it's difficult to sometimes explain how to do this to people, but it was like I made a decision. I made a decision that I was going to start taking care of myself. I made a decision that I was no longer going to disappoint or abandon myself to please others, and that upsetting or disappointing other people was going to have to happen so that I could feed myself, so that I could keep my tank full, and so that actually I could give to the world in the way that I wanted to, not in the way that I'd been conditioned to.
Yeah, and
I think that's lovely. I think that's lovely. I think a lot of people maybe listening, or certainly that I know, feel that they've got to get their not okay child or their inner child to a place of not being so terrified, or maybe behind them, so that they can find that strength in the adult to be able to put themselves first or put in a boundary. Because actually for some people that I work with, even putting yourself first feels, well, I know for so many codependents as well, it feels so narcissistic even.
But I think there has to be an element in that of fake it till you make it, though, because I think, you know, it's otherwise you're waiting to be in adult, and that's not how it goes. The growth happens through trying, you know, it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, you know. I think that's part of the learning process. Because again, if you think about, well, when did we learn to not have boundaries? From such a young age. That's like you're saying, Lou, that inner child part of us, that emotional part of us is still at that age, but it's only going to grow through trying stuff out and looking around and realizing, actually, no, today I am safe. Today I am managing to handle this.
Maybe then, I mean, it's more about picking the people that you start to put the boundaries in first with, that they're a little bit safer than you're going to your father who is abusive or whoever else immediately and trying to have a voice with somebody like that.
Yeah.
And I think my boundary setting became, well, I think before I did the inner child work, before I did the trauma workshops, the peer melody work, all of that stuff, before I worked on my codependency, I wouldn't have had a chance in hell of being able to set a boundary. I needed to do that inner child work first to have that to have that ability to care for myself from my adult self.
Yeah.
And I absolutely say that from a trauma-informed place for me, and I can't speak for everybody, but the inner child work had to happen first.
Yeah. And I think part of that growth, when you're saying about setting boundaries and that inner child work, absolutely happens in therapy. You know, experiential role play is excellent for this, and trying it out and seeing how you feel as a result of doing that. Yeah, it's got to, you're right, it's got to be in a contained, safe place to start off with, and whether that's with safer people that you start setting some boundaries with, or whether it's in a therapeutic environment,
or even if it's in the Trauma Thrivers group, you know, because you know, most of us, please God, that I know anyway, in our group are very trauma informed, and it is a safe place. And if anybody were unboundaried in there, you know, Mel or I would be able to, you know, come in. So I want people to use the group in a way to try and have those voices and to try and speak up for what they need or what they want. That it's practicing around safe people, isn't it? And safe others.
And I also
what
think,
do you think?
Well, I was thinking about what we've all been talking about just now for a little while, about how to kind of just get started and just make that decision. And in that context, I was thinking about how I think it can be important to acknowledge all the fears that come up, because, and those are the kind of old fears, I think, from childhood, that and I think just having an awareness of that can help, because that kind of confirms what the kind of mammoth task it is. So there's a fear of rejection, there's a fear of disapproval, there's the fear that someone's going to get angry, or there's a fear of abandonment. And when you start thinking about, you know, those incredible fears that are connected to just that little first step of setting a boundary, no wonder it's so difficult, you know, because it just brings up every kind of worst fear that we could have if we did suffer early relational trauma, in fact.
And it's going to bring up grief as well, because a lot of those fears do get realized one way or another. And as you grow, you might be grateful for the fact that certain relationships have ended, but as you're going through it, the grief of that loss of hope that maybe if I try it this way, it's going to be different. And then actually, no, I'll set this boundary. And that means that the relationship can change in a way that you don't want it to change.
Yeah, that's so true too, isn't it? Because we don't know if somebody's going to accept that boundary or if they're going to walk away.
Yeah, and the question, am I creating conflict? You know, I think as trauma survivors, a lot of us have probably spent so much of our lives trying to avoid conflict, and getting started on this journey of setting boundaries as like, you know, it's going to create conflict. And that's, you know, that is I mean, even thinking about it sometimes still creates a trauma response in me, you know.
I was terrified of anger, you know, for years. I couldn't ever think about making, you know, putting in a boundary in case I made that other person angry, because I actually couldn't sit with somebody's anger. You know, thank God a few years of group therapy sorted me out quite well, you know, me having to be the therapist and everybody else was angry. But it's really hard to, say no sometimes when you know that that's what it's going to elicit. You know, really, really difficult. So how do we deal with the fallout, or what tends to happen even when we first start putting in boundaries? What are the repercussions?
I think the first thing that springs to mind is that, at least what happened for me when I started, was there'll be fallout and then I'd backtrack, and then I'd gaslight myself and say, well, you know, maybe I went too far, and maybe I was unreasonable. And so I think it's definitely a case of trial and error initially.
Yeah, I think your reasons for setting the boundary can get minimized. I think I've been accused of being cruel, mad, brainwashed.
Selfish, I think, is a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you do get a lot that comes your way.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's about, I go back to, you know, this knowing that I am right, knowing what my truth is. And I almost have this visual of me as a tree. You know, I am going to stay firm. I am going to stay rooted. I am going to stay grounded in this, because I am not going to be told any longer that I don't know my truth. I'm not going to let other people dictate to me what my truth is, no matter what happens. And I say this to people all the time, you know, you bet your ass there is going to be some uncomfortable stuff that goes on when you start setting boundaries, because what I have to remember is that I am breaking years of destructive behaviors, of years of unhealthy patterns and systems within my family, you know. And if we look at things like racism and homophobia, you know, they are big parts of my boundaries now. They are things I will not allow into my life. We are breaking patterns of years of systemic stuff that has been happening. So yes, people are going to get uncomfortable around this stuff, but I am not going to let you tell me what I know my truth is anymore.
And I hear you, and what comes up for me, thanks Mel, when you say all of that, is that, you know, boundaries and setting boundaries for me is the kind of ultimate in self-care. And for years, you know, whether you're in addiction or self-harm, or you're medicating your trauma in some way, there are no boundaries, because there's so much of punishment that happens with the self. You know, so when we start to put in self-care boundaries, and we start to take care of ourselves and stop punishing ourselves and really looking after ourselves, boundaries with others has to be a massive part of that jigsaw. Because if we're not going to treat ourselves badly anymore, or punish ourselves, or have that internal dialogue of self-hate and loathing, how dare we let somebody else do it to us? Because like I'm the only one that's going to criticize and have a go at myself. I don't want you doing it as well. So it's an ultimate kind of act of self-care as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that growth of self. And if you think about, you know, with family of origin and setting boundaries with family of origin, and how attachment trumps trauma. So even when you're trying to set a boundary because of developmental trauma, the attachment that you have with that person is still going to make it so painful. And it is only through the growth of yourself and the care for yourself that's really going to make that possible, because you value yourself so much that, you know, you're not willing to give that self up for anyone or anything. And I don't mean that in a narcissistic way. That's not to the cost of others. It's just not to the cost of yourself.
That's a really good point, though, because how do we deal? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that we're talking about not in a narcissistic way, because actually, how do we deal with narcissists, or how do we deal with people that continually push our boundaries?
Well, it's how you feel about that, really, because I think, look, it's a given. You know, if you think, I mean, Brené Brown talks about boundaries, doesn't she, and how it's an act of compassion. And if you're trying to set with a boundary with someone who cannot be compassionate, who cannot be empathic, then that's really when the wall is going to come up. I mean, I've had this in my life where I've tried different boundaries, and then it's actually got to a point where really it's no communication. It's become no communication. Yeah. And I don't think it's going from 0 to 90. It's not going there immediately. You know, it's negotiating and trying to see if they're willing to accept what you have to say. But when it's very evident that that's not the case, you have to take care of yourself, and that can mean no contact.
Yeah, and I think as a kind of strategy, if it's impossible to go no contact, I think if you have a relationship of any kind, family member or ex-partner perhaps, and especially with narcissistic individuals, you will know that there's a bit of a pattern. And I think what can help there is to, in fact, have a bit of a plan of action, a bit of a strategy. The next time that, you know, I don't know, your mother or whoever it is says X, you have a prepared, you know, answer. This is what I'm going to say, and I'm not going to then get drawn into a kind of lengthy conversation where I'm going to end up being made wrong. So yeah,
there's
yeah,
something
just
called
planning.
grey rocking. Grey rocking as well, when you just
Yeah.
become like a grey rock and just,
Yeah,
you know.
I have to say, I just from personal experience, I had to have a very staged boundary setting with my brother, who was he sexually abused me when I was younger. And so what I felt was setting boundaries with the person that I had the strongest trauma bond with was the most difficult person. And I had this very staged journey to set it, to get to the point of no contact, because for me to have set that boundary straight off was too painful. I couldn't do it, and what was associated with it in terms of how it would affect the rest of my family, the retaliation that I would get, the feelings that, you know, my go-to as a sexual abuse survivor is guilt. So I knew if I cut him off straight away, I wouldn't be able to live with, you know, the feelings of guilt that I had would be so overwhelming that I wouldn't be able to maintain the boundary. So I had this very, very staged boundary setting process with my brother.
And Melanie, was that planned, or was that in hindsight you realized it was a stage process?
I would say it was part and part. I kind of, in my mind, knew that I probably needed to get to the point where I had absolutely no contact with him. But I think to keep me okay with that, the conscious process was, I'll try this first. And if this doesn't work, then I'll go to the next stage. But if it does work, then maybe we can stay at this level of contact. So it was probably a sort of a 50-50 there, Jacky, I would say.
And also I'm thinking in settings such as work situations, if, you know, if there is a person at work who frequently violates a particular boundary, again, to have a kind of planned answer or a planned kind of strategy there, I think that can really help.
Well, it's about learning how to speak up as well, isn't it? You know, going back to the point earlier, you know, if somebody oversteps our boundaries or at work, or oversteps our physical boundaries, or our, you know, any of our boundaries, it's about how do we find the voice to say no? You know, how do we find that courage to speak up, just to start to say energetically no? You know, and I wonder if there were some things that you used in terms of, you know, connecting cords with people. We used to get people to imagine scissors, you know, chopping round their energy fields to kind of get them out, or perspex screens, or, you know, seeing somebody and almost putting a wall up and imagining a wall up if they were an unsafe person. I just wondered if any of you had any strategies that you use to kind of go, you can come closer because you're loving and kind and compassionate and safe, but actually I'd rather you stayed on the other side of, and I'm going to build my picket fence up.
I would say I call on my army. And this is probably perhaps not the most conventional of ways to do it, and maybe slightly controversial, but you know, I like a bit of controversy, Lou.
Love it. Go for it.
I have an army. I have people around me I know I can go to that will give me the power I need to continue to stand firm in that boundary, that will affirm me, that will be behind me going, yes, Mel, this is what you need to do. If you don't do this, this is what is going to happen. I call on my army. and I surround myself with them, and that's what I do.
Lovely.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, it's like that saying, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to raise an inner child, right?
Love
A
that.
whole city for me.
Yeah. A continent.
Yeah, and I think also in you know, in my client work, you know, so quite often we will practice saying no, and to kind of to feel into the energy behind that, because I think when we come from a very kind of timid place, in fact, where we're scared to say no, there's a kind of, we say no from this kind of, you know, timid, submissive place, and then when we want to be really firm, it can almost sound aggressive.
Yeah.
Because we can't quite gauge, you know, how much energy do I put in, and then we might kind of go over the top first before we find that kind of calm, assertive way of saying.
That's really true. And I think we go over the top in not only setting boundaries, but sometimes I think we can be a bit rigid to start with as well.
Yes.
Whereas we've had no boundaries, and then all of a sudden it's like they're really, really firm with everybody over everything. So we can go a little bit that way as well.
Yeah, I think you can sort of shift your mindset. So I think when they're rigid, it's sort of like this idea of you're fighting against stuff. I'm against this and resisting. Whereas you can change a sort of a mindset to what am I fighting for, which is more sort of approaching type thing. Like I'm more sort of galvanizing, if you like. Well, what safety do I want to fight for, and how do I make that happen? And I think that can help shift things a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking about that when we talked about self-care before, because it's almost like certain things, you know, what do I want to keep out and what do I want to bring in?
Yeah. And, you know, that ability to receive rather than give, I think that, you know, I don't want to label codependency, but I think, you know, codependents do find boundaries particularly difficult in my experience, because, you know, most of them have spent our whole lives appeasing, you know, and not saying no, and not being able to set limits. And if you get your validation through other people and by external means, God, if you piss them off or they don't like you, all of a sudden you've got no validation. It's like, who am I if I don't exist through your eyes? So I never forget my first codependent anonymous meetings, in that there were still people who were really please appease, and, you know, can I make you a cup of tea, and what can I do from you, and can I help you? And then there were others that wouldn't even look at you, you know, let alone ever make you a cup of tea, you know, because we'd gone, or I'd gone as well, one extreme almost to the other, in that please appease. No, I'm not going to please anybody. You can all foxtrot Oscar.
And I think the other thing is, you know, the ultimate symptom for me of codependency was the feeling of being responsible for other people's feelings.
Yeah.
I genuinely thought, you know, at my worst in my codependency, that I was single-handedly responsible for the entire world and how it felt.
Yeah.
And so anything that I did would have this huge impact, and it was all my fault, and, you know, it was just absolutely the biggest catastrophe that could ever possibly happen. And so for me, the recovery from codependency and the inner child work, as I said before, was vital for me to be able to set boundaries, because I have to know, on some level, I absolutely have to know that I am not responsible for how other people perceive what I am telling them. I am not responsible for how other people respond to my needs and my wants and what is important to me.
Can I ask you, all of you, what were the first responses that you got? Like, what will some of people watching this, what kind of responses can they expect from other people if that person isn't particularly healthy around their own boundaries? Is there anything that, you know, they can watch out for?
The biggest
Yeah,
thing was
Mel.
defensiveness,
Yeah.
the need to retaliate, the
Yeah.
need to say that they're right and I'm wrong.
Okay.
And to defend themselves. That was, I think, the biggest thing that I came across.
Yeah, I agree.
I came across them just disappearing and then coming back as if nothing had happened.
Wow.
Just
yes.
Let's pretend that conversation never happened, which was crazy making. That goes back to sort of the gaslighting thing, you know.
Yep.
I've also been told that I think I'm so effing perfect, F off, F you. That you know. So
yeah, I've had that too. I can really resonate with that. I was one family member that I didn't speak to for 6 months after a little altercation like that. So yeah.
For me, it was, I think the biggest one for me has been disapproval, because if the reaction from, you know, the environment would be disapproval, then what that would bring up, that means that I'm a bad person, I'm mean.
Yeah.
So it's also about, I think, who do I become if I set a boundary? Does that mean I'm selfish and mean and evil and all of these things? And I think a strategy that I think can help there is to just to say to yourself, it's okay for me to, and then whatever it is you want to do, it's okay for me to feel that this isn't okay. It's okay for me to set a boundary.
It's actually okay for you to put your needs first. It's okay for you to put your needs above somebody else. That's not selfish. That's selfless. That's self-love. That's self-care. Somehow we're all taught that we've got to put everybody else's needs ahead of our own.
I got a really nice story about that, Lou. I did equine therapy. Actually, I think equine therapy is really good for boundaries, actually.
Yeah.
And I was told, you know, put out your hand to the horse to show the horse your boundary. So I did that, and then I started patting the horse, and she was like, you can't pat the horse with your boundary hands. It was like, well, that's pretty telling, isn't it? We haven't even started.
Yeah,
and I always remember that. You can't pat the horse with your boundary hand. You can't pat and protect someone else if you're setting a boundary.
Yeah, that's really good, isn't it? That's a lovely metaphor. Is there anything else that you'd like to say? Any parting words of wisdom? And I don't know, Mel, whether we've got any questions.
Loads of comments. So
Okay.
seems to be something that's really, really resonating with people. So I think I read up about Annabelle. There's a few people here talking about setting boundaries at work. Actually, that seems to be quite a big one.
It's so tricky, isn't it? Because our bosses, whoever they are hierarchical figures. You know, we put them on pedestals as hierarchical, and they do have quite a lot of power because they pay us. You know, so it is really hard at work to try and find your voice and stand up for yourself, you know, and not feel that you've got to go along with what they say. It's a really difficult one, but yeah, I mean, I just think that it's far better to speak up and be clear and say what you need and want and practice it at work, because otherwise what tends to happen is we go into that lovely drama triangle.
I think clarity is really sort of a tantamount importance, actually.
Yeah.
In boundaries at work.
Yes.
Yeah.
What you can do, what you can't do.
There was also a question actually from the other post in the Trauma Thrivers group, where we announced the live, and it was actually about I made a note of it. It was early red flags in a friendship, and
yes.
friendships is something we haven't spoken so much about today, but of course that could be also really pertinent to boundary violations and how do we set boundaries with our friends, and also when we make new friends, how do we kind of recognize the signs there?
This
I've
is
got something to say on that. I think
biggest ones. Go on,
so.
Jackie.
You go.
Well, I was going to say on new friends, I think if you've been practicing boundaries, actually you're starting a new relationship and you're quite sort of certain in yourself about what you're okay and what you're not okay. So sometimes I think, you know, the later stages of life, it's actually easier to start sort of new friendships, really. And I think then with other friendships, it's about a dance, isn't it? There's always going to be give and take, and it sometimes might be 90%, 10%, but it's that sort of balancing out. But like you've said before, when you get that ooh feeling, then that's teaching you something. And I've had friendships where I've managed to share that and that's been okay, and I've had friendships where I've shared that and that's not been okay, and there's been a change in the friendship. Then I think it comes back to, again, the values, like you said, Melanie, about what do you value more? Is the friendship more value than one of your particular values in this case? Can there be a bit of give and take, or is it actually it's a non-negotiable, and if that can't be heard, then that, you know, makes you really think about what that friendship actually is about.
I would say, in my experience, and I have had a very recent experience of this, where there was a huge violation of boundaries in a friendship that I had. And what I learned from that experience was that my fear of not causing conflict, which stopped me from setting some boundaries that I needed to set, ultimately ended in my boundaries being so severely violated that it had a very, very detrimental effect on me. And so my lesson from that is that I need to speak up more, and that if I don't set the boundaries in a friendship, ultimately what will happen is that friendship is going to backfire on me. This has happened in my life many times, and I thought that I'd got to the point where I was managing it a lot better, but I think there are just certain people that I still find it difficult to do that with, and I hold my hands up to that. You know, I'm certainly not perfect by any means in setting boundaries, and friendships are the one that I struggle with the most, actually. But ultimately what it comes down to is that if I don't set them, the chances are that friendship is not going to survive anyway.
It's a really good point.
I hear you. I also think for me there is an ability I have to look within people, and I've always come a cropper in friendships, if this isn't the case, or relationships that can't do rupture and repair, because lots of friendships and relationships, we have a little rupture, or I have a different value or belief about something to you, or we might even have a little argument. I think Jacky said to me something at one birthday a couple of years ago.
I did.
But that was minuscule, but I was able at the time, wasn't I, to say something, and then afterwards, and we could just straight away repair it. Because you could listen and I could speak. And I think red flags for me are about, none of us are non-triggerable, even if we've done however much work on ourselves. I still think things trigger us, but the ability to be able to say that to somebody, and then that person to hear you. And a red flag for me is somebody that never listens, that's always speaking, that always says that projects some of their stuff onto you, or they say that you've thought something or done something, or that there's just no clarity in boundaries. Those kinds of people, or who aren't consistent or reliable, I would start to back away from. So in answer to who is a safe person and who can I have friendships with, they're kind of people that can talk at an emotional depth, really hear you, really understand you. And if they need to change, or I need to change my behavior, I'm open and receptive to that if I think it's going to upset you.
Absolutely. And something that just really came to me, I had to write it down. It feels profound, which doesn't happen often, which is red flags are not, we need to stop seeing red flags as something we need to fix. You know, red flags now for me are a signal to walk away. Whereas before I did my recovery, my codependency recovery, it was a red flag and I was like on it. I was like, I need to fix this, right? But now I see those red flags, and I would say 80% of the time I can go, this is a red flag. I need to walk away from this. This is not something for me to stay and try and fix.
I think, yeah, and I think as your boundaries grow, it's not surprising that friendships that were okay, say 10 years ago or before, you know, the people you were attracted to aren't necessarily going to be the ones that you're happy to be around now. And that's just the way it is.
So true.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think also in terms of learning to set boundaries, that I think, you know, I like what you said, Jacky, about it being a dance that is kind of give and take, because also it depends what, you know, in a friendship, what we're going through. Someone's going through a hard time, and sometimes there's a bit more give, a bit more take, you know, but there's something about it being at least reciprocal or kind of mutual, so it's not just really lopsided and it's you're always giving or you're always taking. And I also think that there's another thing I was thinking about just before, which is that we don't just learn to set boundaries once and for all. I think it's an ongoing thing, really. You know, it's not like I couldn't set boundaries, but now I can. So now it's, you know, all done and dusted. It's not really like for anybody.
No, I still struggle with time is my hardest boundary to set, I think, both with others and myself.
I agree with you. It's, yeah.
I don't know if anybody else struggles with any of the others, but I think that's quite an interesting one to get your head round, is your time boundaries.
Yeah, I've moved to a paper diary so that I can't commit. So I'll get back to you when I check my paper diary, which I don't carry around with me, and that does seem to work. But yeah,
we're all works in progress, aren't we?
Definitely.
I'd like to say. Is there anything else, Mel, that's come through that we need to answer?
I think there are lots of comments, quite a lot of comments here, and I think we can sort of come back to some of them when we go offline, as we did last time, Lou, in terms of answering people's questions. So for anybody that's put stuff in here, do keep an eye on the feed, because Lou and I will come back and answer these questions.
And even if you're watching this later, if you just put replay and in the comment thread, it would be interesting to see how many we get on replay. If you've got any questions or you want to ask anything of anybody in the group, just put it in the comments underneath and we'll come back to it. You never know, we might have a boundaries part 2, because it's such a wide subject. It's quite hard to cover it all in one go. But for today and now, thank you, ladies, very, very much for joining me today on the boundaries chat. And let's see what we're going to bring next week. And I hope we might entice you back.
It was lovely.
For another session. But thanks very much. And we'll just say goodbye, everybody on Facebook at the moment. We'll see you next week. And thanks for joining us. And I hope today was useful. All right. Big hugs.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.